Hi guys, I'm going to continue where the lecture left off on Tuesday, and Adam told me that you guys made it all the way through the synapse and neurotransmission. So I think this was the last slide that you would have seen. So I'm going to start with the cerebral cortex. We're going to talk about brain anatomy. We'll start with the cortex. And cortex means covering or bark, and it's the outermost layer of your brain. It's also the newest part of your brain, and it's where the thinkiest things happen. So intelligence, creativity, memory, language, social and emotional cognition. These things don't just happen in the cortex. These are big psychological constructs, and so they use a lot of different parts of your brain, but primarily these things happen in the cortex. You'll notice that there's a lot of convolution, so it's kind of real smushed up. And the reason for that is to fit as much surface area as possible inside a really small space of the human skull. So think about like you couldn't fit like a whole rug into a small container. You'd have to like smush up the rug in order to fit it into a container. And if you did, it would look like it had a lot of bumps and grooves the way that the cortex does. The cortex is made of it's made of several layers, and cortex proper is gray matter. So gray matter is the cell bodies of neurons, and you can see here, and I don't know, hopefully you can see the mouse moving. You can see this isn't exactly gray, it's actually kind of pinkish. It depends on how you stain the tissue, but it's what's referred to as gray matter, and this is where the cell bodies of neurons are in the cortex. They're densely packed together. The cortex is about 3 millimeters thick in total, although that varies depending on where in the cortex you're talking about. Again, it's highly folded, so those bumps and grooves that I just mentioned, those are called sulci and gyri. Sulci are the grooves or the creases, and the gyri are the bumps. And here's a view of the layering of the cortex. In most places there are 6 layers, and they have different functional significance, so different things happen on each layer of the cortex, and we'll get to talk a little bit more about that. Then the white matter is what connects the neurons together, connects the cell bodies to each other. And typically that's not what's referred to as cortex, although depending on where you are in the cortex, it's kind of hard to separate where the white matter ends and the gray matter begins, only because the white matter extends into areas that are largely surrounded by gray matter. Okay. So here's a view of the cerebral cortex as a cartoon, and from the side of your brain, you can see 4 different lobes. You can see at least some of 4 different lobes. So you can see the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. So the lateral surface, that just means the side. So you're looking at the brain from its left side in this case. If you were to look at a view of the brain, if it had been split in half, right down the middle, this is what it would look like. So now you're looking at what's called the medial surface. So that's the midline, or what you would see if you split the brain in half. And you can see some of the frontal lobe that curls around to the medial surface, some of the parietal lobe that curls around, and then a fair bit of the temporal and especially the occipital lobe is actually visible on the medial surface. Don't really pay attention to this limbic lobe thing. Nobody really says that. We'll talk about the limbic system. This is a view from looking up from underneath the brain. So you're looking at the bottom of the brain. In this case, you're looking at the right side or the right hemisphere of the brain from down underneath it. And so this is the right side frontal lobe. This is the right side temporal lobe from the bottom. And you can see here a lot of the temporal lobe surface is actually on the bottom of your brain. And then this is the occipital lobe. You can't see the parietal lobe from the bottom of your brain. It's more toward the top or dorsal part of your brain. So this is what's referred to as the basal surface, the bottom of the brain. Some major features of brain anatomy. There are lots of gyri and sulci that have names. In our class, we won't focus on learning all of them. I want you to just know some of the more landmark features. So the central sulcus is the sulcus that goes right down, sort of halfway between the front and the back of your brain. And we'll talk a little bit more about what's going on in the precentral gyrus, so this bump that's just in front of the central sulcus, and the postcentral gyrus later on in this lecture, actually. Excuse me. Okay, and then here you see a big sulcus, which divides the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobes. And this is what's referred to as the Sylvian fissure. So a fissure is a big sulcus in the brain. So sometimes you'll see the term sulcus, and sometimes you'll see the term fissure. If you see the term fissure, you know it's a big sulcus. Okay. Between the two hemispheres of the brain is what's called the interhemispheric fissure. So that's the biggest sulcus of all. And in fact, it's not even usually referred to as a sulcus because it really is just a divider between the two hemispheres. And then here, just for reference, is the central sulcus that we talked about before, which again is about midway between the front and the back of the brain. And sometimes people get these confused because this is sort of in the center, but it's not the central sulcus. The central sulcus is between the front and the back of the brain. The interhemispheric fissure is the divide between the two hemispheres. The calcarine fissure is a large sulcus that is part of the occipital lobe, so toward the back of the brain, but is primarily only visible on the medial surface of the brain. So again, if you look inside the interhemispheric fissure, that's where you would see the calcarine fissure, and that area of the brain has a lot of significance for visual processing, and the calcarine fissure ends up being an important divider between the top of visual space and the bottom of visual space in terms of how we process the information, but we'll get to that in, I think, the next lecture. So here again is the medial surface of the brain, and I'm just showing you this image so you can notice a couple more landmark features of the brain. Here is the corpus callosum. So this is a white matter or connective tissue. Actually, it's a whole bunch of tiny axons. And by the way, axons are white, as in that picture of cortex I showed you earlier, and in this picture here, sort of off-white, because they're surrounded by myelin. And myelin is essentially fat or lipid, which, anybody who's ever had a steak that wasn't particularly lean has noticed that the fat is white. And that's the same basic material that's insulating your axons, and so that's the color that you see when you look at groups of axons, which is what the corpus callosum is, because again, it's this big connective structure. It's a bunch of neurons, a bunch of axons that run from one half of the brain to the other, from one hemisphere to the other, to keep the two hemispheres of your brain connected. Okay, just above the corpus callosum is a gyrus, a bump that runs in a kind of a horseshoe shape along the medial surface, and that's referred to as the cingulate gyrus. We'll talk more about things that are happening toward the front or anterior part of the cingulate gyrus related to attention later in the class. Here's a map of brain areas that's referred to as the Brodmann map, and this is named for a guy named Corbinian Brodmann who spent way too much time. It's actually an interesting story. He was almost certainly on the autism spectrum, and one of the things that seems to, and one of the impacts that seems to have had on his life is that actually he was hyper focused and would spend just 36, 48 hours at a time separating bits of the brain, areas of the brain, based on cytoarchitectonics and physical features. And I think Adam W. probably talked about this a bit in the lecture he gave. These are the areas that resulted from the mapping that Brodmann did. They aren't necessarily significant for different cognitive functions, though sometimes they do map pretty well onto divisions between cognitive functions in the brain. But in any case, they're worth being aware of. You don't need to know in this class the different numbers and where they go in the brain. But it's worth being aware of because when you start reading the literature, Brodmann areas are referred to pretty consistently. And that gives us reference points for locating things in the brain. So they're useful even if they don't have a lot of fidelity to the way that cognition is actually divided in the brain. Okay, so I mentioned that we would talk a bit more about what's going on in the precentral and postcentral gyri, so the bumps that are in front of and behind the central sulcus. So starting with the, we'll start with motor cortex. So each area of our body is represented on both cortices, so on both gyri. So starting with motor cortex, or precentral gyrus, there's an area of precentral gyrus for moving each part of your body. There's an area that controls movement or motor function in each part of your body that you're able to move. On the postcentral gyrus, you have primary somatosensory cortex, which is for feeling each part of your body. And so I'm not sure if I mentioned that the term that's used for precentral gyrus is primary motor cortex. The term that's used for postcentral gyrus is primary somatosensory cortex. Hopefully that's clear enough from the slide. Sorry if that was a bit confusing. But the idea is on the precentral gyrus, you have areas for moving each part of your body, primary motor cortex. On the postcentral gyrus, you have areas for feeling each part of your body. And I'll show you maps that make that a little more clear. Just to point out, it's this fascinating thing. Our intuition is that we feel pain in our finger, or the muscles of our toes are what's causing movement in our toes. And that's true, but only in a limited way. Really, what we're feeling, the sort of manifestation of the feeling, is in our brain. And you can prove that by with safe amounts of electrical stimulation, making people feel different sensations in different parts of their bodies without ever actually touching those parts of their bodies, but just stimulating the corresponding regions of somatosensory cortex. Okay, so here are the maps I was talking about. And it's worth having in mind this term somatotopy, which just means body mapping. And the way that body mapping or somatotopy works in the primary sensory and primary motor cortex is essentially what you're seeing here. So you can see that each area of the body has some real estate along both the motor cortex, the precentral gyrus, and the somatosensory cortex, the postcentral gyrus. One of the things you'll notice is that the size of a particular body part, like your back, is a big part of your body. It actually has very little real estate on either cortex, right? That would be somewhere in this area. It's not the size of the body part that determines how much of the cortex is assigned to it. It's your ability to move that body part, in the case of motor cortex, or the fineness of sensation in that body part, in somatosensory cortex. So something like your hand, obviously, you use your hand both for feeling things. It's really important to have good, sensitive discrimination of what you're actually feeling with your hands. It's also really important to be able to move your fingers and hands very finely, very subtly, and with great control. So both the somatosensory and motor cortex have large amounts of space devoted to the hand, even though your hand is a lot smaller than your back. You'll also notice that the way things are lined up along the motor cortex or along the somatosensory cortex is not the way that they stack up exactly on your actual body. So, for example, your hand on these different motor strips is right next to the representation of your face, and that's not the way that your body is put together. Okay, hopefully that is clear enough. And so now I want to get to how we talk about, how we describe brain anatomy. And that's useful because, again, if you are going to be reading literature, and in this class you are, you'll see a lot of these terms used when a neuroscience journal article is describing where in the brain something is happening. So there are ways of dividing up the brain that are sometimes referred to as sections or slices. So if you imagine cutting a slice down through from the top to the bottom of the brain, and so it'd be easier in person if I could show you. But essentially, here you're looking at the brain you're looking at the lateral surface, so you're looking at the brain from its left side. If you were to have chopped down through the middle and then taken the back part and turned it to face you, then this is what you would be seeing, and this is what's referred to as a coronal section or coronal slice of the brain, and that's from the word crown. So you can imagine, a crown comes down on top of the head, and it's as if you sort of extend down through the head, and that's the way that you are visualizing that brain section. If you have questions with some of these, I'll be happy to answer when I get back, and I can actually show you in probably clearer ways in person. Okay, this is what's referred to as the axial or horizontal section or slice of the brain. So you can see here, it's a dimension that goes from the front to the back, and this would be what you're looking at here is, so you've taken this section across the sort of from the front to the back of the brain, and then you've taken the bottom of the brain and kind of turned it toward you, turned the newly exposed part toward you. So this would be the axial or horizontal slice. If you cut down from top to bottom, but you do it in this dimension as opposed to the coronal dimension, so you can see sort of in the dimension that's parallel to the interhemispheric fissure. If you cut down through the brain in that dimension, that's what's referred to as a sagittal slice. So a mid-sagittal slice would be a slice right down through the interhemispheric fissure, and this would be a sagittal slice, but not a mid-sagittal slice. This would be a sagittal slice through the left hemisphere. Okay, so there are a lot of brain terms. Sometimes we end up having multiple terms that mean the same thing, and we're kind of stuck with those because they both, or sometimes there are as many as 3 or 4, they all get used in the literature, and so it's important to know what they mean, even though it would be nicer if you only had to learn one. Here we see 2 basic terms, lateral toward the side and medial near the middle or the midline. Hopefully those are clear enough. So here you're looking at an axial slice, again with the bottom or exposed you've taken the bottom of the brain and you've turned the exposed part toward you. So this would be the right hemisphere, this would be the back of the brain, and this would be the interhemispheric fissure. We use the terms superior and inferior quite a bit to describe toward the top or above, as opposed to toward the bottom or below. There are other terms that mean the same thing. So dorsal also means toward the top. Ventral also means toward the underside. We use the term anterior or rostral to mean toward the front. Posterior or caudal to mean toward the back or toward the tail. And so I'm showing you these alternate terms for the same thing, and not that it really helps you, but it may just be instructive to know that the reason we have two terms for these is because a lot of them are from the animal literature. So, for example, if you're talking about toward the tail, that would make a lot more sense in an animal. But it's also worth noting that in most animals, including manatees, which are just amazing animals, the brain is oriented in the same line as the rest of the body, as opposed to in people, where the brain is oriented perpendicular to the rest of the body. So, for example, ventral refers to the bottom side of an animal. In a human, it only refers to the bottom side of the brain, because your belly, the bottom of your brain, is not in line with your belly. Hopefully that makes some sense, but it is actually worth knowing both terms for each direction in the brain, because they really do get used a lot. And for example, you wouldn't just see the term caudal used in animals. That is used to describe human brain anatomy. Okay, navigating the brain sometimes involves talking about the directions of things relative to each other. Directions and positions of things relative to each other. So this slide is intended to take this star as the reference point. So starting from this star, things that are on the same side of the brain or the body, for our purposes the brain's the most important, are ipsilateral to the reference point. So ipsilateral means same side. So if I describe something happening in the temporal cortex, and then I wanted to say there's something happening in the parietal cortex on the same side of the brain, I could say ipsilateral parietal cortex. So this is the midline of the brain. Again, we talked about the term medial. Relative to this star, something that's nearer would be proximal. Something that's farther away would be distal. And it's also true that sometimes the terms proximal and distal are used to refer to things that are near the midline and far from the midline. So you could think of it either way, but for our purposes, really just proximal is near, distal is far. Contralateral means things that happen or that occur on the opposite side of the midline from whatever reference point. So in this case, our star is our reference point. If we observe something in temporal cortex on one side, and we want to talk about something happening in parietal cortex on the other side, then we would say contralateral parietal cortex. And a term that we will probably go over again, but may be helpful to know, is the term decussation, which is a term that refers to traveling from one side of the brain or the nervous system to the other, which a lot of axons do. So anything any information, say, that comes in on the left side of your body is actually transmitted to the right side of your brain, and so that would be an example of decussation from the contralateral side to the ipsilateral side, if that makes sense. Okay, so I think that mostly covers the cortex, and at this point I'm going to start to get into subcortical structures. This is a slide with a lot of stuff on it, and you don't need to know. You don't need to know all of this. I'll go through the things that are worth knowing. This is just to give you kind of a frame of reference for where these subcortical structures are within the larger brain. So one thing that's worth knowing about the subcortical brain is that it has a irrigation system, sort of, or at least a drainage system, and this is what's referred to as the ventricular system, and it's full of a fluid that is called cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. And CSF is produced in the lateral ventricles. So the lateral ventricles, and this is a little tricky to see, and I don't know if the 3D visualization is going to work in this mode, but I can show it to you when I'm back in person. Do your best to try to understand through looking at the book, or if you don't have the book, through looking at tools online. But again, I can show you if you have questions about exactly where these things are. And it is tricky. Subcortical structures are the trickiest to locate, to kind of understand exactly where they are. But lateral ventricles are these two here. So this is one, and then you can see behind it, there's another one that's shaped exactly the same way. It's just on the other side of the brain. So there are two lateral ventricles. And cerebrospinal fluid is produced in the lateral ventricles on each side of the brain by a little organ called the choroid plexus. The CSF, or cerebrospinal fluid, then flows out of the lateral ventricles into what's called the third ventricle, which is this thing in the middle. And there's only one third ventricle. It's right along the midline, so there's just one. And after that, the cerebrospinal fluid flows down through the cerebral, it's what's called the cerebral aqueduct, as it heads down into the brainstem and toward the cerebellum. And then here, just in front of, or just anterior to the cerebellum, is what's called the fourth ventricle, which is just kind of an opening in this drainage pathway. Eventually, the cerebrospinal fluid makes its way out of the brain and into the space between the skull and the brain. And that's actually one of the really important functions that the cerebrospinal fluid serves, because your brain is really soft and smushy, and the bones around it are really hard. And so if the brain was to whack into the skull, that would be a problem. And in fact, it is a problem when that happens. And so it's really important to try to have some buffer against brain smacking into skull. And so this fluid that the brain is essentially floating in does that job, and does it pretty well. Now, it's important to point out, we evolved just the right amount of cerebrospinal fluid protection so that a normal person could run at a normal human speed and accidentally whack into a tree or something like that and not have a lifelong problem with concussions. We've developed a number of ways to overmatch our evolved protection. Some of them sports related, some of them motorcycle related, and so there, we've found a lot of ways to concuss ourselves, and there's a lot of concussing going on, as I'm sure you're probably aware. But that's because we're doing things that actually our cerebrospinal fluid is not sufficient to protect us from. One of the other really important things that the cerebrospinal fluid does, and the ventricular system is designed to do generally, is to clear the metabolic waste that neurons produce when they are active, when they fire, and well, not just when they fire, but actually the byproducts of cellular processes that keep them alive. Those byproducts flow out into the cerebrospinal fluid, and flow down through the spinal cord and out through the spinal column, and ultimately are eliminated as waste when you pee. Okay, so that's a trip through the ventricular system. Other subcortical structures of interest. The thalamus is an important structure in the brain for communicating information that comes in from the body and needs to make it to the cortex, or information that goes from the cortex to the body. Again, these subcortical structures are the hardest to really locate. It's really hard to do a good diagram for where they are. 3D visualizations tend to be more helpful. But the thalamus is right along the midline, and actually there is a left thalamus and a right thalamus. So you have two, one for each hemisphere. In the thalamus, it's kind of a football-shaped structure. And it's a group of nuclei. And as opposed to when you're talking about a single cell and the nucleus is just the part where the DNA is, a nucleus, when we're talking about brain anatomy, is a group of functionally similar or functionally bunched neurons. And that means a bunch of neurons that are all involved in doing the same job. So, as I mentioned, one of the primary things that the thalamus is doing is it's relaying information, information that comes in from the body, goes first to the thalamus, and then on to the appropriate area of cortex. That's true for all of our senses, actually, except smell. And that's one of the interesting things about the sense of smell, and some people have argued that that's why smells can actually have kind of big impacts on us, particularly emotionally, because the sensory information, the olfactory sensory information, goes to a place that's very near emotional centers of the brain, and we'll talk about that a bit, without any kind of filtering or relaying. Okay, but yeah, information sent from that is sent from the thalamus goes to places like primary sensory cortex, including primary visual cortex, primary auditory cortex, primary somatosensory cortex, which we just talked about, and then that information is processed further by higher levels of cortex after it reaches those primary sensory regions. One of the things that is important in the thalamus is that it has to maintain spatial representations or spatial mappings of things like our bodies, so somatotopy, which we just talked about, and the visual world, which mapping of the visual world into brain space is what's referred to as retinotopy, and we'll talk about that more when we get to vision. But that has to be maintained as the information travels through the thalamus so that it can make it to the cortex intact. Okay, just to the outside of the thalamus in each hemisphere of your brain is a structure called the basal ganglia, and it always looks to me kind of like a tadpole, and so if we think of this as a tadpole, the tail of the tadpole is what's referred to as the tail of the caudate nucleus. So that has a name that it has a tail in its name because it looks like a tail. But you have to kind of remember the head of the caudate is not this, which sort of looks like the head of the tadpole. The head of the caudate is here, which kind of looks like the neck of the tadpole. And then this part of the tadpole, part of the basal ganglia, is called the putamen. Tucked underneath the putamen, tucked inside, kind of close to the thalamus, is another nucleus called the globus pallidus. And again, this is really a lot easier to see with a 3D visualization. And I don't know that I'll be able to run one. I have one built into this lecture, but built into the slides. But I may have to wait and show that to you when I get back. I'm not sure it's going to run in this way. Here you see a structure called the amygdala, which we will talk a fair bit about throughout the course of the class, and this is just sort of to help you locate it, but it is sort of here at the end of the tail of the caudate nucleus, which, as we'll see, is also kind of toward the end of another structure called the hippocampus. And the basal ganglia does a number of things. One of the things that it's important for is initiating and, to some extent, controlling motor function. But it also contributes to cognitive function as well. So one of the things it really helps you with is learning or detecting patterns, which turns out to be a very helpful thing to be able to do. We'll talk a bit more about that. The caudate and putamen together. So that means the tail of the caudate, head of the caudate, and the putamen, the whole tadpole, put together is what's referred to as the striatum. So sometimes you'll see that term if you're reading a journal article in neuroscience that might have anything to do with motor function or pattern learning or many of the other things the basal ganglia helps with. And so it's useful to know what the striatum means, and it gets that name because depending on how you stain it, it can have striped appearance. Then, just to make things more confusing, the putamen here, the head of the tadpole, and this globus pallidus nucleus, which is, again, tucked in underneath there, they can be grouped with the name lentiform nucleus. That's something you don't see as often, but you see it sometimes, and it's worth knowing. Okay. This is supposed to be a 3D visualization, and yeah, I don't think it's going to run in the way that I'm doing this capture, so I'll show it to you when I get back. I'm also going to show you a video of a synaptic impulse, or an action potential. Okay, all right, that's what we just saw. This might help because it's just kind of another angle on these subcortical structures. Primarily what I want you to see on this slide is the structure called the amygdala that we just talked about, and this structure called the hippocampus, which I mentioned. Now, these together, along with some other structures, are what's referred to as the limbic system. And the limbic system, different things either get included or excluded depending on which source you're reading, but the amygdala and the hippocampus are consistently grouped in the limbic system. So those are the two that I would really expect you to know if I was asking you about the limbic system. And you can see here that the thalamus is along the midline, just to sort of keep you oriented. And then this curling around thing, which is not actually blue, but it's blue here, is called the hippocampus, and that's from the word meaning seahorse in Greek, and it's because somebody at some point thought it looks like a seahorse. In fact, I think there's a picture of a seahorse on the next slide. The amygdala gets its name from the word that means almond. The hippocampus is very important for memory. And we'll talk more about that. We're going to spend a fair bit of time talking about memory, but you can just kind of know that that's a memory structure. The amygdala is very important for emotion, and particularly for certain kinds of emotion. And just as kind of a precursor to things that we're going to talk about more later in the class, but are worth you knowing, it makes sense for an emotional emotion capture mechanism in the brain, or an emotionally reactive part of the brain, to live right next door to our memory structure, right? Or a key memory structure. Because things with high emotional valence, things that are either really good or really bad, especially things that are really bad, tend to put really distinctive stamps on our memories. And to be very memorable. And that the reason for that, the reason those things are so memorable, is because of the strong input from the amygdala to the hippocampus. Here you can see just, this is a view sort of from the front of the brain, and so you're looking at the thalamus, and then moving out to the caudate and the putamen, and still can't really see the globus pallidus, sort of see it hiding in there. And then you see how the hippocampus kind of curls around with the tail of the caudate, and the amygdala is just kind of hanging out there toward the end of both the tail of the caudate and the hippocampus. Okay, well, there's a picture of a seahorse. So this is an MRI image of an actual brain, and you can see, but only if you know what to look for, that this is the hippocampus. You can't see it curling fully around. This is just kind of the bottom part of it. This would be a coronal section, and then really zooming in on medial temporal cortex. You're not going to need to know this, but in case it's interesting to you. And then this is the hippocampus, so you can see it kind of curls around. It sort of folds over as it curls around. Again, maybe not something that all of you care to know, but perhaps some of you do. Okay. Another really interesting structure in the brain is the hypothalamus. So hypo just means less than, or in this case underneath. So hypothalamus is right there under the thalamus, and this is a structure that's important for controlling our internal states. So things like temperature, hunger, thirst, wakefulness. These are all things that actually, again, it's sort of, they feel like they are self-generating, like just the lack of food equals hunger, or the lack of sleep equals tiredness. But actually, these are sensations that we have because of signals that are sent from our brain. And if you were super, starved, if there was no food available to you, or if you didn't sleep in a week, but the signals from the hypothalamus didn't go out, you wouldn't feel hungry, or you wouldn't feel tired. It's that feeling of tiredness, the experience of tiredness, that is a product of the signals that are controlled by the hypothalamus, not the actual kind of starved or sleep-deprived state itself. The goal of the hypothalamus is to maintain equilibrium for all of these things, so that we're not too hot or too cold. We're not too hungry or overstuffed. So when you've eaten too much, your hypothalamus sends a signal like, okay, this was like that full feeling. Again, that's something that comes from the hypothalamus. And so that's why the metaphor that's often used is to refer to the hypothalamus as kind of the thermostat for the body. Just like when you set your thermostat to a certain temperature, and the hypothalamus is directly important for temperature in the body, so it's not that far-fetched of a metaphor. When you set your thermostat to a certain temperature, the thermostat then tries to keep your house from either going too far below or too far above that set point. And in order to do its job, the hypothalamus has to receive input from several sources. Now, it receives input from other brain areas because determining these equilibrium states can be kind of complicated and can't just be determined from signals from the body. But a lot of the signals come directly from the bloodstream. And that's an interesting thing about the hypothalamus, because actually most of the brain is largely protected from many of the larger chemical signals that are carried in the brain. And that's because actually the membranes of the vasculature, the tubes that carry blood to the brain, are not very permeable. So that is to say, there's a lot of stuff that's in the blood that could actually be harmful for a lot of your brain cells. But the hypothalamus is open to more of those things that are carried in the blood, and that's because the hypothalamus actually has to receive certain signaling chemicals from the blood in order to know things about your body, in order to know things about your wakefulness, for example, your wakefulness state, those signals have to be carried through the blood. And another thing that the hypothalamus has to know is, okay, when have I released enough hormone? So if there's too much hormone traveling through the blood, the hypothalamus needs to be aware of that. So those are reasons why the hypothalamus has to be open to receiving some of the things that are in the blood that other parts of the brain actually can't receive. So that's one of the unique things about the hypothalamus, is that what's referred to as the blood-brain barrier, which is not like a wall somewhere between the blood and the brain, because certain things from the blood actually need to get to all of your neurons, but this very selectively permeable membrane that protects most of the brain from a lot of what's in the blood is a lot more permeable, a lot less selective at the hypothalamus. And right, so then what's happening is the hypothalamus is regulating the release of hormones into your bloodstream, and the release of hormones, or hormones traveling through your bloodstream, is what's referred to as the endocrine system. So the hypothalamus is very important for controlling the endocrine system. And the actual release of the hormones into the bloodstream, although the sort of calculations happen in the hypothalamus, the actual release happens at the pituitary gland. There are other glands that release hormones, but the pituitary really is the major gland for releasing hormones. Other glands sort of work in concert with the pituitary. So I think that's probably all we need to cover for today. But there are a few things that I mentioned that are 3D visualizations or animations, and I will try to make time to show those to you in class. So this was a new experience for me, doing a video capture, and hi from Texas, and I look forward to seeing everybody next week.